European Union, the Bread for the World, then the Open Society Foundation, including Avena Americanas. And thanks as well to OCISA for providing particularly the Portuguese interpretation, which interestingly is not an interpretation that you often find on these spaces, but always great to have to ensure inclusivity within this conversation. So in terms of the structure of the webinar, what we will do is we have 2 presentations that will be given. And then following those presentations, we are going to have Q&A for the questions at the end of the presentations. And as well as please, during those presentations, make use of the chat, for any interactions that you may have, right? So if somebody says someone that strikes a thought, please go ahead and put that in the chat. Or if you've got a question that comes immediately, go ahead and put that in the chat, because I know sometimes you think of a question and at the end of the presentation, we're asking questions and you've sort of forgotten about that point, right? So please make use of what is available. So in terms of the presentations, we will have Tess Woolfenden. I hope I said your name right, Tess. She's a Senior Policy and Research Officer from the Jubilee Debt Campaign. We will also have Bhumika Muchhala, who is a Senior Policy Analyst from Third World Network. And then we'll also have Nick Dearden, who is the Director for Global Justice Now. By way of quick introduction, my name is Chenai Mukumba. I think you can see it already at the bottom of my screen. I am the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at Tax Justice Network Africa, and work really closely with Eurodad and fully support all of the initiatives that they take, and are honored to be able to help facilitate this conversation today. So without any further ado, I've already taken up a little bit of time. Tess, I'm going to now pick on you to go ahead and give us your first presentation on debt data portals, as well as guides on accessing debt information. So Tess, are you keen on sharing? Do you have a PowerPoint presentation that you'd like to share?
I will share my screen. Yeah, I'll share my screen.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Yeah. Great. So you can go ahead and share your screen, Tess, and really looking forward to what you have to share. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me here. I've been following this webinar series, so it's nice to be a part of one of them, especially the last one. So yes, as Chenai said, I'm going to be presenting on the topic of debt data, which is quite a big technical topic with loads of different elements. So rather than giving a training session on everything that's available, I'm going to present an overview of what debt data exists. So you can start looking for it for yourself and use some of that data and analysis in your work. And I'm going to do this by giving an introduction to 2 different resources that Jubilee Debt Campaign have created. The first is Jubilee Debt Campaign's Debt Data Portal, and the second is Jubilee Debt Campaign's Guide to Understanding and Accessing Debt Information, which covers a lot of the different ways you can access debt data. So again, this isn't going to be so much a training session, just an introduction to what exists and where you can find it. So let's start by me sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone can see this. So this is the guide to understanding and accessing debt information. And I wanted to start here because I think this is a good way of getting an overview of what debt data is available and how to access it. And just to note, I will share links to everything that I'm sharing in the chat box once I've finished speaking. So this document is essentially a step-by-step guide in where to find debt data and how to use those different platforms. It starts with an introduction, as you'd imagine, and then outlines some key concepts which are useful for understanding debt information. And then it moves on to giving different ways of finding relevant data. So the guide summarizes 4 different ways of accessing data, which I'm just going to briefly summarize now. So if I just scroll down. So the first one that the guide looks at is data from the World Bank Debt Statistics Database, which actually looks a little bit like this. This portal is a really good starting point for accessing data on government external debt, including total debt owed, debt payments, And then it also provides breakdowns by different creditor groups, which I believe is a relatively new function of the portal. It also contains some information on debt payments into the future as well. So you can see on the left-hand side, it's relatively simple to use. You can select filters for the data you want to see by country, counterpart area, series, which is the specific data set you want to see, and then time. And once you've searched for that, you can end up finding a table a little bit like this. So this gives you a breakdown of the specific data you've asked for. And it looks a bit confusing with the different terms and abbreviations and stuff, but the guide really breaks down what each of those things mean. So it should be relatively easy actually once you've got your data to understand it. So the second source the guide looks at is the IMF and World Bank debt analysis, sustainability analysis. So I think this series previously has already covered that there are two different types of debt sustainability analyses, one for PRGT countries and then other for market access countries. The ones we're most interested here is analysis for the PRGT countries. So in these documents, you can find out things like what the IMF analysis of the risk of external debt crisis for that specific country is. And in some cases, these documents also include a bit of information on who that debt is owed to. And again, if I scroll down, you can see an example of some of the other data you can pull from these documents in tables that look a little bit like this. And it looks, again, it looks a little bit daunting, but the guide breaks down which data from this table is useful and also what specifically it means. So for example, you can see number 1 here is giving us the total external debt. So that's both for public and private sectors as a percentage of GDP. Or number 2 here, it shows us the total debt owed, including interest rates by that country. And you can see underneath then against each number, there's a guide of exactly what that information is and why it's useful and how to use it. So then if I keep scrolling down, we get to the third data area in this guide. And this is information you can collect about bonds. So because bonds are publicly traded, you can access some information about them. A lot of this information is behind expensive paywalls, but there are some free sites where you can find relevant information. So again, this guide goes into detail on exactly how to do this, but I do have an example up here somewhere. If I can just open it. Here we go. So this is the information of one of Zambia's bonds on this website. And this is from Business Insider, which is one website of a few different ones where you can access free information about specific bonds. So on this website, you access information about this one specific bond that we've looked at. So on here, you can see, for example, when it was issued. So that's 2014. And then in brackets, the 24 here means that the bond will come to maturity in 2024. If I scroll down on the right-hand side here, you can also see different information about the bond. So for example, the currency that the bond was purchased in, or the coupon or interest rate, the maturity date, etc. And if I go back to the guide, the last bit of information that the guide covers here is information on bilateral lenders. So again, the guide kind of goes into detail on how you can collect this information, but it breaks down accessing information about China's lending, and then also accessing information about lending by the Paris Club. I think also since this guide was written, the UK government has started publishing their bilateral loans to developing countries on their website, and other G20 countries have also committed to do the same. So it could be that more information on bilateral lending is available at a national level in due course, hopefully months, but you never know. So that's a flying visit through this guide and what's available, and hopefully gives you a bit of a taste of what you can see in here and how it can be useful for your work and gathering data. There's another site that I'd like to quickly show you, which is Jubilee Debt Campaign's Debt Data Portal. So this was set up last year as a space to compile key statistics and analysis on the debts of countries and governments. The idea behind it is that the data and analysis on this site collectively provide a comprehensive view of the debt situation of each country that's on this portal. So I'm just going to start by giving a bit of an overview of what's on here. So when you come to use it, it's familiar. So the top part in purple here just gives a bit of information about the portal and what's on it. The interesting part really starts when we get to these 6 tabs here. So each of these 6 tabs gives us a different set of data or analysis to do with debt. So the first one here is the IMF Risk Analysis, and this comes from the IMF directly. Then here, on the first tab, we have Jubilee Debt Campaign's Risk Analysis, which I'll explain a bit more about in a second. Then on the third tab, we have Government External Debt Payments as a proportion of revenue. Then we have Net Creditor Debtor Statistics, which basically shows the debt owed by the whole country. So that's government and private sector debt compared to the debt owed to that country. Private external debt, and then current account balance. And each set of data is represented on the map underneath. So that's here. So each set of data you can see represented on the map. Then to the right, there's also a key which details what the different color coding means, and a bit of information underneath about why this specific set of data or this specific analysis is relevant and important and how it's being calculated. For some of the tabs, you can also select the year of the data that you want to see. So you can see that change through time. And then another useful part of this is you can actually also collect a snapshot of this data for each country. So if you go to the map, we can just click on any country here. This opens a pop-up and it compiles all the data that we have on the portal for that country that you've clicked on. So you can see that there's Jubilee Debt Campaign's Risk Analysis, there's the IMF Risk Analysis through time, Government External Debt Payments as a proportion of revenue, and all the other data sets that I've mentioned on here on this tab. And then lastly, just at the bottom, all this data is presented in table format, just to make it easier for you to access. Then just to mention at the top, we have an about page, which just gives a bit more background to the portal and why it was created. We have details of Jubilee Debt Campaign's risk analysis, so why it was created and what data we've used and why we've done it in a certain way. And there's also a tab on sources, which gives information on what data we've used for each analysis and why. And you can also access the raw data behind the portal on here. So if you want to download the Excel spreadsheet that goes behind all of this, you can, and do your own analysis and calculations using that. So just before I end, I thought it might be quite interesting to look a little bit at the IMF risk analysis versus the Jubilee Debt Campaign risk analysis, because I feel like that's one of the really useful parts of this tool and this portal. So if I start with the IMF risk analysis, this essentially shows what the IMF thinks a country's likelihood of being able to repay its external debt is. So this information is collected directly from the IMF. And if we look at the categories here on the right, red represents a country having stopped paying its external debt. And then orange to green represents high, moderate, or low risk of that country stopping paying. But the IMF risk analysis has a few flaws. Firstly, they only do this analysis for 70 of the world's poorest countries, which is why so much of the map is not filled in here. Secondly, there might be gaps in the data where governments have blocked the analysis being published. And then also, probably one of the most important elements of this is when doing the analysis, the IMF is not really taking into account the impact of paying the debt on the economy of a country or the ability of the government to protect the economic and social rights of citizens. They're really simply asking financial questions and asking, can this country pay? So taking into account those flaws, Jubilee Debt Campaign has created a methodology for doing its own risk analysis, which is what you can see on the first tab here. So one of the first things you might notice is that the analysis has been done for a lot more countries, so a lot more of the map is filled in. You might also notice that the color coding on the right here has different categories. It means slightly different things on this tab to the IMF Risk Analysis tab. And this is because Jubilee Debt Campaign has included the risk of private debt crisis in their analysis as well. And the reason we did this is because a debt crisis can be caused by debt owed by the private sector as well as governments. Private debt can also lead to a financial crisis as it passes the debt on to the public or the public sector. And if we think back to the global financial crisis of 2008, this is exactly what happened here. So JDC felt that it was important to include that in the risk analysis presented on this portal. Jubilee Debt Campaign's definition of debt crisis is also broader than the IMF's. So here we define a debt crisis as when debt payments undermine a country's economy and/or the ability of its government to protect the basic economic and social rights of citizens. So whereas the IMF was looking only at financially, can this country pay, JDC is questioning what's the impact of paying this debt on the population of this country or the economy of this country as well. So if we go back to the IMF risk analysis here, you'll see that there are about 6 countries in red here, which means there's about 6 countries they assess to be in debt distress. But if you go back to Jubilee Debt Campaign's analysis, we put this number to be more at 52, which really highlights kind of how the different methodologies create such different outcomes. But it also highlights some of the glaring gaps in the IMF risk analysis as well. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there at the risk of giving too much information at too quick a pace. But I really hope this has been helpful. And as I said, it's not so much a kind of demo, but more just a light touch introduction to what some of the data sources available are, and hopefully some useful resources there are to help you navigate and use them in your work. I think there's a Q&A session, so I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have on this as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tess. That was really, really interesting. Ironically, you were talking about the Zambia case study. I actually live in Zambia at the moment. And before I moved to Tax Justice Network Africa, was a part of the civil society movement that was just trying to raise awareness on debt and its implications. So thanks for that. That was really, really interesting. I also absolutely loved, I think, the comparative you made between the work that you're doing as the Jubilee Debt Campaign vis-a-vis the work that the IMF is doing. It completely resonates with some of the concerns that we had as civil society as well. So you literally finished with a minute to spare. So that gives us a little bit more time for Q&A. What I can see already is that there is a huge call for you to share this information. And so I can see already that colleagues from Eurodata are saying that they can share that and that they're sharing the link. But I think a lot of the listeners are keen to be able to access the information that you just shared. I can't see any direct questions. So I'm happy to get the ball rolling. And then I think colleagues, as you're listening, please feel free to put in some questions in the Q&A, and we will get to you to ask those questions. So my first question for you, Tess, is based on my previous experience when I was working at national level. In Zambia, of course, now a country pretty much in debt distress. We had been calling the government to highlight the fact that we were heading, towards a detrimental situation. Mm-hmm. They were using the IMF threshold that you referred to, right? And saying, listen, we're not even close to where the IMF says that we should be concerned about, right? And our big argument was, yeah, but the minute you start relocating resources, from education, from health, from water and sanitation, from social protection, that is a crisis. Because ultimately what you're doing, right, is taking away the resources that you need to protect your citizenry, which is exactly your role as the state. So I'm really curious to know, because I know, you know, that Jubilee. My first question is, have you ever engaged with the IMF on your way of sort of, oh, I can see somebody asking me a question, but have you ever engaged with the IMF on the way that you guys are sort of working with debt distress? What have they said? What have been their responses to that question? And secondly, and linked to the first one, what's their reception, right, to the way in which you interpret debt distress? So I'd be curious to hear those questions, largely because, you know, it's the IMF that often have offices in the ground, you know, and are engaging with civil society, you know, and are then sort of sharing this information. So that's my first question. And then I can see there's a question that's been asked to me, so happy to then go back to that. So Tess, if you could help with that.
Of course, yeah, it's a really good question. I should start with a bit of a disclaimer that I wasn't part of creating this analysis. So it was done by my colleague, Tim Jones, who is currently on paternity leave. So I haven't seen how the portal's been used in that way a huge amount. But what I can say is that there has been quite a big CSO push, as far as I understand, for the IMF to improve its debt sustainability analysis.
Yeah.
From what I understand, the IMF have, perhaps in rhetoric, started saying, oh yes, these things are important. We should take into account how debt is impacting on people and climate and all these other really important social and development needs. But as far as I understand, it hasn't yet gone beyond rhetoric. I believe Eurodad did some analysis last year on whether the IMF were including the risks of climate in their debt sustainability analysis, and out of a number of documents, it was only cited once. So as far as I understand, that there are conversations happening, but the IMF have yet to move beyond kind of positively speaking about it or rhetoric into anything meaningful.
Yeah, I think that's something we've seen a lot with the IMF. I think, you know, they tend to in rhetoric, right, in conversation, indicate that they fully support, you know, civil society and what we call for, etc. But then when you actually look at the detail, right, that's why we always say the devil is in the detail. We can see that the actual implementation is slightly differently. But I mean, I think I would absolutely encourage, I mean, increased engagement with the IMF, because I think what you guys are doing are essentially showing the impact, right, the direct impact on the citizenry, which I think is, for me, the ultimate objective of this goal, right? Great. So I can see a question from, I think your name is Jom. I hope I've said your name correct. I'd like to ask Ms. Mukumba, what effect is the fall of the kwacha having on food prices? Is there any data on the effect it's having on incomes? I've seen in the Zambian press that some politicians are advising people to eat kandolo and abandon some expensive foods. I can see already that this is a Zambian who has written this. But I think what effect is the fall of the kwacha having on food prices? I can talk from a personal experience. The amount of food that you can buy based off of, you know, a couple of years ago has completely decreased. We've seen inflation go through the roof. And this is just due to, you know, a number of economic factors that are having. One of them absolutely is the debt situation, right? And this is the thing. Debt has implications, right, on so many different areas of the economy, and also at its center, the citizenry. And so part of that is what we're seeing in terms of inflation. I know inflation right now in Zambia is 26%, which I know for many sort of European countries is almost unheard of, but you know, that's where it is. Yeah, so there actually is a lot of press coverage on that issue at the moment. And you know, I think a lot of people are starting to feel that. And the politicians, I think to some degree, don't experience it in the same way, right? Just because, of course, they live much more lavish lives and have access to more resources. I can also see Jom saying she's given a website that she says has very good information as well on currency markets and almost everything related to economics. Tess, I'd be curious to know, so she's given, I think it's called tradingeconomics.com. Have you interacted with that site? You know, what are your thoughts on getting information relating to debt at the tradingeconomics.com website?
It's a really good question. I've never engaged with that site. So I can't share. Yeah, I mean, in terms of accessing information on bonds and stuff, I know there are quite a few different, there's a few different online websites where you can access that information for free. But as I said in the presentation, like a lot of that information is behind a paywall. So it can be quite challenging to find it. But also just a lot of the information isn't accessible at all. On private debts. There's a big transparency issue and a big data gap in that area. So yeah, any sites that anyone can share where we can access that information is fantastic. I'll definitely be saving that link and taking a look at it later. Okay, all right, perfect.
Okay, I can see another question from Andrew Kaufman. Andrew, are you happy to speak to your question? I know I've got colleagues that are happy to unmute you. So that you can ask that question verbally. Okay, all right, no problem. Okay, so Tess, Andrew has a question, and so I'm going to give, I think, both you as well as Yolanda an opportunity to answer it. But Andrew says, you know, I've always appreciated the Jubilee Debt Campaign's guide to understanding debt information. However, when accessing the World Bank International Debt Statistics database, I've run into some questions that exceed the scope of your guide, and I've had a difficult time getting information from the website / the World Bank staff themselves. Have you encountered any other useful resources for navigating the nuances of the World Bank Debt Stats database? So Tess, I'm going to throw that to you, and then Yolanda, feel free to add whatever you'd like to contribute.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I haven't come across any other guides personally, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. Right. I would also just say, I'll drop my email in the chat, but feel free to drop me a line with some of the specific questions you have, because I'd be really happy to look into those and see if we have any additional information that I can share with you on that. But yeah, I'll defer to Yolanda to see if she knows anything, because I'm interested to know the answer as well.
Awesome. Yolanda, over to you.
No, I also think it's a really, really good question. I always bother the World Bank staff with these kind of questions, asking them even the most simplistic ones. So I have this hope that this will influence the way they share the information and maybe make more simple explanations of what the different indicators mean. That's one. Second is that, I thought Tess would say that, but Jubilee Debt Campaign, besides the guide, they did a webinar, I think it was a couple of years ago or last year, on accessing information, and that webinar is online, and it's really helpful because it goes through the international debt statistics database. And the third is I always use the network. I always send an email to colleagues, and there's always someone who knows what that means. So insisting on what Tess finally said, do share, because others can have the same doubts. So do share those doubts with us, with the Jubilee Debt Campaign, and with others, because we can also push for more clearer information into those statistics. But yeah, I wanted to share that I always try to get an answer from them. So use the kind of contact us if you have any doubts. I do use that, and sometimes it's been useful. It's sometimes they just get you back to the original methodology space in that database, but sometimes it's useful.
Great, thanks so much, Yolanda. My next question was going to be to ask you to send the link to this webinar that you were mentioning, but I can see that Ilaria has sent that. So I think for anybody who would like, I think, a little bit more information about what Yolanda has shared, that's in the chat, and so you can access that conversation. Awesome, and I think Andrew is happy with the responses that we've been given. And then in addition to that, to everybody who's listening into this webinar, Tess has shared her email address. So please feel free to get in touch with her for any sort of clarifications or questions that you might have on this particular topic. So I'm just checking to see if there's any questions that I may have missed. Ilaria, is there anything that that has come through that I'm not seeing? Okay, that one has been answered. Okay, great. I think that's useful. That's useful to know. I think what I'm going to do is, because we're going to take a break very shortly, almost as last words, Tess. You have this information, you have these data sources, and we're about to enter into the second session that speaks around mobilization and advocacy strategies. Could you speak a little bit about what you're doing with this data, right? It's super interesting, absolutely fascinating. And I said, humanizes, right? The impact of debt. You have this great resource, and I think you've indicated you've been talking to the IMF to see the extent to which they could start to integrate, I think, some of these components in what they're putting together. But not only that, I think the work that you're doing is much more comprehensive. You indicated that the IMF only has a couple of 70 countries, and you know, your map is much more widespread. So with this information, what are you doing with it? I think it's an excellent segue into the next session, where we're going to have Bhumika and Nick talk about sort of mobilization and advocacy strategies. So can I ask you to answer that question, and then whatever sort of last words or remarks that you'd like to share about data, please feel free to share those now as well. So over to you, Tess.
Great. Yeah, it's such a great question. And you're right, it ties really nicely into the next section of the webinar. I would say that this data and this analysis has been hugely helpful for our work across the whole spectrum of our work. So in terms of advocacy, it's so helpful to have big numbers that we can really use to amplify and kind of demonstrate the points we're trying to make. And that's not just with the 52 countries number, it's all sorts of different types of statistics. So one we used recently in a joint campaign with groups in the UK was that I think it's something like African countries collectively are going to be spending 3 times the amount more on debt repayments just to private creditors this year than it would cost to vaccinate the entire population. And you see numbers like that really starkly highlight how problematic debt repayment is to ensuring the health and human rights and well-being of the population. So campaigns also highlighting those numbers in campaigns, and also demonstrating, I think with the IMF analysis, it really demonstrates gaps in how the powerful actors that dominate this space, kind of how their analysis really has holes in it and has gaps, and demonstrating that there are alternative ways of doing things. So really across the board, it's just helpful to have these numbers, and it's helpful to be able to access those spaces and know where to pull the numbers from and know that you can access them when you need them, which is hopefully what this guide does. It hopefully creates step-by-step real details on how to access that information, and the webinar as well. Thank you to Yolanda for sharing that. And the debt data portal also kind of pulls those things together. But yeah, obviously there probably will be things missed across that. So my last word would really just be say, please do get in touch if you have questions or things that will be useful. I think as an organization, we really want to make sure that we make our resources as useful as possible and fill in those gaps. So yeah, please do reach out. Thank you so much.
Let me just unmute myself there. Awesome, thanks so much, Tess. So just a quick disclaimer as well. Tess had mentioned that during this session, she wasn't going to get too technical. So please feel free to get in touch with her if there's anything of a much more technical nature that you'd like to talk to her about. So really what she did was give a very broad overview in terms of where you're able to access data and share, right, information about what the Jubilee Debt Campaign has been doing vis-a-vis the different resources of access to data that are available. So Tess, thank you so much for the time that you put in sharing that. It was quite illuminative for me as well. I'm actually just thinking when I was a local civil society, when I was at like a local civil society, I wish I had access to that information, because we were always at odds with our governments, right, about the implications of debt. And I think those numbers and those charts that you've just shared would have been so useful, because I recall actually sitting on a panel the one time where, you know, we were talking about, is Zambia in debt distress? And, you know, the government saying, no, we're not, you know, and us saying the points I'd made earlier about, listen, but when you take a look at our budget, the amount we're allocating to debt servicing is increasing, right? Because it's denominated in US dollars, the kwacha is depreciating, and then the allocation to other key social sectors is decreasing. This for us is a crisis, right? If we don't put in place the necessary measures we need to do so now, in a couple of years now, we will find ourselves in a situation that's almost irreparable, which is where we find ourselves. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm hopeful that it's useful, particularly for institutions, you know, that may be wanting to have these nuanced conversations with their governments pertaining to, you know, debt, its implications. So we are now just going to take a 10-minute break before we enter into our next session. Super excited about this because it builds on what Tess has just said around mobilization and advocacy strategies. And we will be having Bhumika, who is a senior analyst from the Third World Network. And following that, we'll have Nick Dearden, who is the director of Global Justice Now. I'm super excited about this because activism is something that I'm very passionate about. So I think I'm gonna allow everybody to go grab a cup of coffee, you know, just take a walk, stretch your legs. And then after that, we will resume so my clock is showing me, I won't say the hour, but it's 40 minutes. It's showing 3:40, which is, I know, different for different time zones, but I'm thinking if we can come back in 10 minutes at 3:50, that would be great for us to then reconvene. So thank you so much, everybody. Looking forward to catching up soon. See you soon. All right, welcome back to everybody. I hope you managed to get your coffees, stretch your legs, grab a glass of water. We are now going to be moving to the second session of today's webinar. I'm very excited about this, like I mentioned earlier. And for this session, we're actually going to have two different speakers, like I'd mentioned earlier. We are going to have Bhumika Muchhala. You're going to have to forgive me, Bhumika, I'm struggling with your last name. Who is a senior policy analyst from Third World Network. Again, close partners of ours. We really work well with them, particularly the Africa coordinator. And then we have Nick Dearden, who is the director of Global Justice Now. So Bhumika, I'm going to ask you to open us up, right? So we've just had this really, really interesting session from Tess, just sharing with us you know, about where to access this data, right? Which I think is really crucial. And like I said, even just at a personal level, really illuminating in terms of, you know, where I can get data that humanizes the implications of debt. Now that we have this data, right? What are the next steps? So I'm going to ask you to open up, like I mentioned earlier, the session on mobilization and advocacy strategies. So Bhumika, over to you.
Thank you, Chenai. Really appreciate this opportunity. So thank you to Eurodad and all the really stellar organizers, Chenai and Ilaria. My last name is Muchhala, by the way, but no worries. I've have lifelong experience in it being twisted this way and that way. So absolutely no worries. It's a clunky, long Indian name. My name is Bhumika. I'm at Third World Network, and since 2009, I have been the Senior Policy Researcher and Advocate on Global Economic Governance. Sort of over the years, mixing focus areas on the UN and intergovernmental negotiations and financing for development, SDGs, as well as the international financial institutions, particularly the International Monetary Fund, and global economic governance processes. So fiscal and debt justice is a key area of focus, and the intersections between them, as well as the structural drivers of inequality. So what I'm gonna do in my brief presentation, and I apologize, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I've promised to make it available for the resources page. So I'll make that available later. So what I'd like to do in my presentation is really talk about the structural drivers of debt injustice, both from a historical and political economy standpoint, and to make the linkages with the root causes of the structural dependency that underscores a debt injustice, right? To go beyond just the narrative of structural dependency on external credit and borrowing and short-term market access, the pitfalls of the piecemeal and inadequate debt initiatives in the very paltry multilateral sphere, but to look at some of the defining principles required for going into the roots, particularly looking at economic diversification and the barriers and constraints to industrial policy that have created the foundational drivers of structural debt dependency, you know, in the kind of erosion of the economic integrity of developing countries, right? So to start with, to say that debt distress has arguably become the most defining macroeconomic characteristic, not just of the pandemic, right? It's not just the pandemic. And it's not just that even before the pandemic, developing countries had historically high sovereign debt ratios and the boom in private debt, and the grossly unjust fact that lower income countries are spending $144 million a day on debt payments right now today, and that so much of the global south is already allocating more resources into debt service payments than they are to healthcare and education. So not only the pandemic and not only the 40 years of neoliberal history since the late 70s, but really to contextualize debt injustice as a key component of the logic of a asymmetrical power in the global economic system, that the international economic order is really governed by a logic of domination through financialized debt, and the way in which this logic of domination, you know, going from historical era to today, has remained rather consistent while changing in coercive to indirect forms, right? So this is further exacerbated, of course, by an unfair international tax system where we see, you know, tens of billions of dollars being drained out of the global south. And this is effectively a very coherent logic of wealth drain, of resource drain, right? We know that the inadequate and piecemeal initiatives of the G20, which Eurodad colleagues and debt justice colleagues around the world, especially in the global south, have been calling out repeatedly. Our colleagues at APMDD, at Afrodad, have been calling out all the various pitfalls, the lack of private creditor and multilateral participation, the temporary ad hoc nature, the constant detraction into piecemeal debt relief, crafted schemes, suspensions and moratoriums that fail to actually go toward systemic and structural debt resolution mechanism on the multilateral level. We know that there are massive issues with credit rating agencies playing a punishing role with their problematic issuer pays model, and that they downgrade the risk ratings of developing countries that seek debt relief and are another form of punishment and are another form of enforcement. So all of these initiatives, what they do at the center is to evade reform of the international debt architecture. So civil society organizations in the process of mobilization, I think in 2020, really expanded and deepened the political narrative of debt justice. And I think this expansion and deepening of political narrative has been really critical. What we're seeing today is a real linkaging of the indebtedness of countries in the South as both a consequence and a tool for colonial domination in the present time. And that a systematic analysis of the debt crisis needs to account for the fact that people of countries in the global South have paid for their debts incurred in so many ways, time and time over, with their money, their livelihoods, their safety, well-being, lives, and the health of the planet. Recent academic research quantifies drain from the global South through unequal exchange since 1960, finding that drain from the South totals 62 trillion, or 152 trillion when accounting for lost growth. The scale of these numbers sort of just really isn't the point. The point is that the intensity of exploitation and the scale of unequal exchange increased significantly during the structural adjustment period of the 1980s and 1990s, and this is relative to the colonial era. And a second key point is that this drain from the South remains a core feature of the world economy today, that rich countries continue to rely on imperial forms of appropriation to sustain their high levels of income and consumption. And in the pandemic, their magnificent fiscal stimulus packages. So we see the linkage, right? Indebtedness doesn't exist without surplus. This logic of drain is at the heart of debt injustice, right? And at the center of this is, of course, gender and racial inequality, in that, capitalism really relies on the normalization of a gendered and racialized global economy. And so we cannot evade the discussion on really looking at racial and feminist justice. Race and feminist justice need to be at the center of our analysis of debt justice and fiscal justice. Also, the linkage to austerity is really important from a global South perspective. Austerity is not just an economic policy travesty. It is a filler. It is an enforcement mechanism for debt repayment, right? So in the absence of a multilateral debt restructuring mechanism, that is when the austerity mandate is again enforced in order to generate financial resources to meet debt repayments, in order to protect and affirm and assure the creditors. So the real sort of political economy drivers of the austerity debt linkage, that the public budget cuts and regressive tax measures recommended today by the IMF's loan packages to a vast number of developing countries as tracked by Eurodad, Oxfam, and many others, we see once again that austerity is deployed in a very systematic way to assure private and official creditors of debt repayment, even at the cost of gross violations to economic and social rights, as well as the right to development. So, you know, we know in general the injustice of austerity, right? We know that it's not just academics and researchers, but also the IMF's own independent evaluation office. And even in 2016, the chief economist of the fund wrote a piece called Neoliberalism Oversold, where they really admitted, and the World Bank too, in various reports, has mentioned that fiscal consolidation has led to an exacerbation of inequalities on myriad levels, right? That the erosion of public systems of health and education, social protection, pensions, public wage freezes and layoffs, the way it targets the public wage bill of developing countries, which sustains teachers, nurses, doctors, and public civilians, and especially from a feminist economic analysis, the way in which unpaid care work acts as a shock absorber. So not just the mere sort of fact and consequence of unpaid care work really being exacerbated, but to really ask the question that isn't it carried out on the back of women's unpaid care labor, on the expectation and assumption that gender inequality will sustain, will carry out the shock, right? And the same with regressive value added and consumption taxes. We know throughout history, they disproportionately affect the poor and women and children and families. So it's on their backs, and it is deliberate in the unspoken and implicit assumption, right? So there is this unfortunate irony of denying public health, education, and social protection systems financing in a time of pandemic and intensifying climate change when they are most needed. Achievement of SDGs and Paris Climate Agreement are also effectively derailed. And one of the key things in this analysis really is to look at the fact that if during a pandemic and ongoing, the intensification of climate change during the last year and a half, which shows that public systems are going to be the most crucial aspect of loss and damage and recovery and rehabilitation, that if in this twin existential crisis of public health in the current moment, as well as climate change, if public systems cannot be prioritized, we see that there is a real sort of cognitive dissonance. There's a real sort of empathy and moral dissonance between policy paradigms and global realities, right? So I want to just quickly, I don't want to repeat the civil society recommendations that the incredible Financing for Development Civil Society Coalition have already put out in many forms. But I just want to iterate that why do we prioritize advocacy and a mobilization in the global economic, in the global governance fora of the UN, right? Why the UN, right? And there is an instrumental need to focus on the IMF and private creditors and the G20 and all the OECD rich country finance ministries and finance officials. But there is also a need to look at what is offered in terms of principles and ethos in the UN. So I want to just highlight three key principles that really lead to this international debt architecture imperative. One is the right to development. Second is common but differentiated responsibilities. And third, an inclusive and bold multilateralism. So if we take these three as sort of like three of many, many principles, but three key principles, and we look at the 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development, it's not talked about much, but it arises out of the ethos of the new international economic order. And it is important because it takes a human rights framework that generally is on the individual civic and political basis, right, of individual human rights. And it applies it to the collective, human rights in the collective, meaning the right to development as operationalizing a human rights framework to address historical structural inequalities and power asymmetries in the international financial architecture. So while it may not always be the most politically savvy route, this principle is a precise promotion of an enabling international environment that ensures equity, access to resources, and the kind of economic and social changes that are guided by the imperative of eradicating social injustices. And I think it underpins the SDGs, but it could be a principle that could be brought up much more in advocacy and strategy. The differentiated responsibilities is incredibly important because that also relates to looking at the moral imperative of a multilateral mechanism for international debt architecture, right? It arises out of Rio principles on sustainable development, but it's a core part of all UN processes. For the Global South, the repeated emphasis on differentiation is a critical principle in the face of rich countries in intergovernmental negotiations, as well as in multilateral initiatives, consistently attempting to impose universality or attempting to impose a quid pro quo. So based on differentiation, there is a clear rationale that developed countries a far greater responsibility to deliver actionable means of implementation, and a greater degree of responsibility for concrete reforms, right, for national policy space and international enabling environment. Inclusive multilateralism, you've all heard so much about the need for a bold new multilateralism. This is a time to really amplify and renew multilateralism. We need a green Marshall Plan, we need a new Marshall Plan. We've heard this rhetoric and we've heard this narrative, and it's incredibly important. But the issue is that the G20 claims multilateralism, and surely the Bretton Woods institutions claim multilateralism. There is an imperative on the inclusive convening power of the United Nations, where is one vote, one voice, universality, where the voices of small island countries and the narratives of economic injustice and struggles can be heard on a global scale. Many people, I'm sure, I've been one of them too, sort of ask the question of like, what did these UN negotiations achieve, or what did these discussions achieve? It's not making concrete policy change. We've got to focus on the G20 and the IFIs and the OECD finance ministries to achieve real change. But there is an imperative to keep the momentum on the legitimacy offered by the presence of the narratives of the South. What is the counterfactual? That must be the question asked. The counterfactual is the absence of inclusivity, the absence of global South voices, which leave economic governance in the elite circle of an incredibly asymmetric governance system of the Bretton Woods institutions and G20. We all know the governance system of the IMF and World Bank gives the United States veto power, gives very little voice to developing countries, and the G20 is a tokenistic inclusion of some economically richer developing countries, but not at all a substitute for inclusivity. The other key issue for advocacy and strategy is that we need to maintain the focus on systemic and structural drivers, systemic and structural roots. We're talking about the international capital mobility and capital account deregulation and financial sector deregulation, the imperative on protecting and aiding and abetting creditors and investors and corporations through tinkering and changing the legal architecture, whether it's through investment agreements, the WTO trade rules, or the banking rules laid out by, the big investor banks. So in this way, we need to recognize that the G20, IMF, and World Bank often propose reaction responses, policy fixes, short-term band-aids, and the constant creation of lending vehicles, right? So the need to place systemic attention on capital flows, financial deregulation, and debt is provided by the UN as well, and especially through the financing for development process, which arose from the active discontent of developing countries about the systemic shortcomings of the international financial architecture. So I just want to conclude with sort of laying out, that what we see today is a colonial continuity of structural dependency. We see that the state has not been rolled back. The state has not been diminished. The state has been effectively deployed to serve the market through the creation of legal norms, right? And legal protections and imbalanced rules. So, the way that 20th century neoliberalism works today is not just the well-known policy pillars of liberalization, privatization, and deregulation, but within debt injustice, we must see the ways in which the state is effectively deploying macro structures and governing institutions, not to liberate the market as the rhetoric often goes, but rather to encase and protect the market. And to conclude, just to really emphasize that the structural dependency to international capital market access, the threat of the withholding of short-term credit, and the enforcement exercised by international creditors, credit rating agencies, and commercial banks, it really marks a shift from the territorial imperialism of direct plunder to debt imperialism of indirect plunder, but also a systematic appropriation of financial resources, autonomy, and agency. So in many ways, this has been actually a far more sophisticated project of cementing enforcement in the absence of a world government, in the absence of a singular imperial power such as the British Empire. And the root drivers in terms of the lack of domestic revenue creation and the constraints and barriers to economic diversification, as well as illicit financial flows, must be a core component of a holistic approach to strategy and advocacy in debt justice campaigning. And here I'm talking specifically about the trade and investment rules that lock in extractivism and primary commodity export orientation in the ways in which primary commodity dependency really prevents value-added production, backward and forward linkages, decent work opportunity, food security, right? The economic self-sufficiency of not having to import food staples. And so we need to look at technology transfers, the production investment nexus, the way productive activity then creates a virtuous cycle with investments. And we need to look at the fact that the trade rules underpinning intellectual property rights are central to debt justice and really make these linkages the way climate and debt are being interlinked. We need to also interlink intellectual property rights to debt justice, in that the centrality of technology to the global economy in modern history is undeniable. Since 1820, the scale of technological innovation accounts for approximately 80% of income divergence between rich and poor countries. So I leave you there in terms of a plea to look at the ways in which investment treaties as well really constrain the historic industrial policy tools, which of course today have to be green industrial policy tools, sustainable industrial policy tools, but that the focus on national economic diversification through structural transformation should not go amiss in our civil society efforts in constantly sort of reacting and combating and tackling, what is thrown at us from the economic powers. So ultimately, a call for holistic solutions of structural transformation and making linkages between different movements and engaging actively in building more radical political narratives. Thank you.
Bhumika, thank you so much for that. That was incredible. I think somebody even commented as you were speaking that it was such an excellent analysis. I think what is fundamental to what you're saying is that in order for us to really address the debt issue, we need to be looking at the systemic issues. A lot of these sort of surface temporary measures that are being proposed and put forward, really all they're doing is kicking the bucket down the line, right? Because at the end of the day, this debt remains with many of these developing countries. But I also love the point around the fact that you mentioned that there has been so much exploitation, right, of developing countries, right, over the years, to the extent that you almost think, not almost think, but like we have been contributing to, right, what's been happening within the global system. And so this current debt situation is really almost at odds, right? When you take a look at history within its longer purview. And I think also, the point that you make around the austerity measures that are being employed by, not employed, but I mean, this also refers to, I think, what Tess was saying earlier, right, by the IMF and some of their recommendations. I find that as well to be quite interesting because it's almost to protect, the repayments to the debtors themselves. But I think for me, what struck the most was you saying, if in a pandemic, right, if in a situation where we are losing lives the way we are losing lives, right, we still are not able, right, to identify the moral imperative to address this situation, you know, it really speaks to such a cognitive dissonance with the global order, right? I mean, like I'm based within the African continent, and you know, we got lucky almost to say, right, with the previous wave. With the current wave, I mean, I know individuals who have died from COVID. I had COVID myself actually the previous time, and my experience literally when I went for testing was the same person who was testing, right, when somebody came in to get their results would literally put the swab down and go through, you know, a list of files to give the results and then go back to swabbing, right? There is insufficient resources being allocated to where we need it most, right? And this current debt situation and the lack of a solution, right, that is, like you highly indicated, systemic and sustainable, is really something that is quite cognizant. So thank you so much for what you shared. Really, really resonated with, I think, me and a lot of people who are in the call. So now I'm going to hand over to Nick. Nick, I think keen to hear your thoughts as well, hear a lot about your experiences around mobilization and advocacy strategies. Can I encourage everybody who's listening, please start putting in your questions, you know, in the Q&A section so that we have an opportunity to respond to those. Nick, over to you.
Thank you very, very much. And I'm going to really build on what Bhumika has said and try not to overlap, but really talk about how we frame this for campaigners and activists in our societies. And of course, I'm talking from the perspective of an activist in the global north. I can't speak from any other perspective, but hopefully I can pull out a few lessons that I've learned in my own life, and I hope they're not too random. So I worked for Jubilee Debt Campaign back at the time of the financial crisis. And it was very interesting because here in the North, we'd run the big debt campaign around the millennium, right? So that was where the Jubilee movement came from. And in the North, and the South, the Jubilee movements were a bit different. So in the North, the Jubilee movement, especially in Britain and America, was kind of controlled by the big NGOs. And the way that debt had been talked about was almost a charitable problem in a way. It was kind of premised on, well, these countries have got themselves into a mess, but, you know, they're very poor. We're very generous. So we need to just wipe this debt out, right? Because otherwise it's going to be very bad for them. So it was kind of this religious, moralistic kind of feeling that went along with it. And in some ways, the big NGOs thought what they achieved was amazing. And from a certain point of view, I guess it was, right? This is a very technical issue. They managed to cut through it with a very simple moral case. And they achieved something, right? I mean, they achieved a degree of debt cancellation, not without problems. I mean, that debt cancellation was conditioned on more austerity and more structural adjustments. So there were big problems. But anyway, some of the debt was kind of cancelled. And I know that many of my activists in global justice now were part of that movement, and they still remember debt as an important thing. It was an important part of their lives. But there was a big problem, a big problem with how we talked about this, because when another debt crisis struck in especially 2008, the big one, right? And this is inevitable from everything that Bhumika said. Like, debt crises are a constant feature of unrestrained capitalism, but we hadn't really educated our activists. We hadn't educated our campaigners to understand that. So when another debt crisis came along, they were like, "Well, I thought that had been solved." Like, we were out in the streets, we were protesting, we were trying to do something about this, and you told us it had been. And some people were kind of like, "Well, I guess you can't help some people, right? You can't do anything about this." So we reached this kind of dead end. And I mean, I remember when I started at Jubilee, and we were talking about Greece, we were talking about Ireland, we were talking about Spain, we were talking about a debt crisis in Europe. And some of our activists were like, yeah, but these are rich countries. We're not bothered about debt in these countries. They can sort themselves out. So it was really poor. There was a failure to convey a structural, systemic understanding of where this debt came from, and that this debt wasn't just this kind of pile over here that had been created in the 1970s and needed to be reduced, but it was it was a system. Debt is a system, as Bhumika describes. And so we needed to talk about it in a fundamentally different way. And that's what we began to do and started to do at that time. And one of the things we started doing particularly was asking, and of course groups in the South had been doing this for years already, were saying, but actually, what is this debt? Was it legitimate in the first place? How was it run up? Like, where did it come from? And of course, there are lots of examples at the time of specific projects that were atrocious in themselves. I mean, you know, even if they created no debt, I mean, the idea that countries were being loaned money so that, you know, dictators could buy arms to repress their own people is horrendous in itself. And even today, you know, I mean, I'm sure some of those projects still exist, but even without those projects, when you look at the way that bond markets operate, when you look at the fact that the countries who most need resources in a pandemic have been forced to borrow at rates of, you know, 10 to 20%, while governments like mine are borrowing at a rate of nothing, essentially, right? What's the justice? What's the legitimacy in this system at root? And so what we were interested in is how we could begin changing this narrative and look at it from a perspective of justice, not charity. Now, there were various ways we did this. One of the ways, as I said, was we ran a big campaign about the way that our government gives export credits, so basically supports exporters to export our goods made here to the South. And then if anything goes wrong with that, that export becomes a debt that the South government owes, regardless of how useful these exports were, regardless of how much anybody wanted them or they helped anybody's lives. So we began to critique this. We also began looking at personal debt in our own society. And I wonder if this is something that, and Jubilee has continued to do this today very well, I think. Once you start looking at student loans, once you even start looking at mortgages, once you look at how people in our own society who are not well off get into debt, you begin to understand this isn't just a choice that a kind of rational economic actor makes, right? There's a choice here, and at the end of the day, if it goes wrong, well, I have to pay my debt because that's my moral obligation. No, that's not how most people get into debt. Most people get into debt because they don't have a choice. And once we can begin to understand that in our own lives, maybe we can begin to understand it on a global level too. And so there was a lot of work around, people know the Occupy movement at the time, which was very big, and they were down here in the City of London, and we were down there working with them, who were encouraging people who were in debt to come out and talk about their debts publicly. One of the problems with debt is there's a great morality around it, you know, in the West, but probably around the whole world, I imagine, right? This is my moral duty to repay this debt, and it's embarrassing. You feel guilty and ashamed if you're indebted. So one of the things we were trying to do was to get people to overcome that and say, no, in some ways, I'm a victim of this system, of this debt system. I didn't have a choice. And actually, I repudiate this debt, right? And you had people ripping up their loan agreements. And just the fact that they were talking about it, frankly, for the first time as something not to be ashamed or embarrassed about, but to understand their role in this system of financialized capitalism was useful. It was a useful way of trying to create a relationship with those in the global South that was not based on charity, but was based on solidarity. Like, we have different roles in this system, but ultimately, you know, we can all be victims of this system. And then we ran a campaign, and I just want to say just a few brief words on the campaign we ran. So we started running a campaign on what we called Vulture Funds. And we did this because the banks and the financial sector were very unpopular in 2008, and probably still are for many people today. And so we said, well, actually, let's look at how these banks actually behave. And we started looking at the most aggressive forms of hedge funds and investment funds that we called vulture funds at the time, that were essentially buying up debts of southern countries. And they paid almost nothing for these debts because they were on the secondary market. They'd been defaulted on a long time ago. They picked them up for nothing. And then they would sue the country concerned for the entire amount and more, and interest and whatever else they, you know, charging them for the hassle. They sued them in London and New York particularly. So we had a particular point of leverage here. Not everybody has that, but we had a particular point of leverage because these countries were being sued in London. So we tried to create an outrage about this, and we talked to politicians, and it was very difficult. Once you put this case to them, well, these aren't even the original people that lent the money, right? This is just how the financial system works. A debt can be bought and sold, and this debt has been bought by companies with the sole aim of making a country's life, a government's life, very, very difficult. And it became fairly easy to convince quite a lot of people that this was just wrong. And I remember we did a lot of stuff with imagery of vultures. We actually hired some vultures and we stood outside Parliament and MPs came and they had the vultures on their arms. And we won the law, right? So we prohibited this activity. It was only applied, unfortunately, to a very small amount of the debt. So it was, you know, not the biggest victory in the world, but it was something. And I wonder whether we're beginning to think now whether we should start doing this again, but actually whether we need to go bigger than just, because what we don't want to do is create the idea these are bad apples, right? This is, okay, most capitalists are reasonable, but these are bad capitalists, right? This is people behave like this. Okay, it's at the extreme end of the spectrum, but essentially this is how the system works. And through explaining something as simple as a vulture fund and a nice analogy with a bird and so on, you begin to understand how the global market works and how the financial market works. And so one of the things we're doing at the moment is just thinking how we can try and put pressure on BlackRock, on HSBC, to try to portray these as the vultures in the global economy, right? You, as corporations, you took a risk. You bought bonds, you took a risk, right? You're being paid a high rate of interest because you knew it was risky. The country can't pay. Your risk didn't pay off. This is I'm taking a quote from Thomas Sankara here and messing it around a bit. But essentially, you know, you took the risk, you took the gamble, and didn't pay off. Too bad. That's why you get your interest. That's why you carried a high rate of interest rate. Right. The worst thing in the world is that the state kind of steps in some kind of moral way and ensures that you're still getting paid, despite the fact that this country cannot support the basic human rights of its people. And to try to put those things next to one another so that people kind of get, oh yeah, this is how it works. And by the way, in the pandemic, I don't know if you saw this morning, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, they have had the best quarter in their history. They have made a higher rate of profit during the last quarter than at any other time in their history. So they're doing very well as these governments are paying them debts that they can't afford to provide decent healthcare to their people because of. So who's the real vultures, and how can we begin changing and transforming the structure of the system? It's not just about cancelling debt. Sure, of course, we need to cancel the debt, but actually it's more about a transformation of the global economy to ensure that it works in a different way and this doesn't happen again. Just a couple of very quick thoughts at the end. I mean, one is obviously this, at the moment, climate change is in all of our minds. And we have here in Britain the UN conference in November. We're trying to tie these issues together, right? Because we're saying in financial terms, as the economy works at the moment, these countries owe a debt to companies here and to governments here. But actually, you can see climate as a debt that the North, the rich countries, owe to the South, right? Because we've plundered the environment of this planet in a way that makes it impossible for those countries to develop in the way that we did. So how are we going to repay that debt? Well, one way is you begin thinking about the financial debt and transforming that into something which is no longer a debt and allows, at least gives these countries a fighting chance of being able to provide for the human rights of their people in what is going to be a very difficult conditions in the 50, 100 years ahead. I think the other thing is we've seen a phenomenal wave here in Britain and America, and I guess it's affected everybody in the world around Black Lives Matter, a new appreciation of colonialism amongst a young generation of activists here. And what I want to do is say, and that's been focused very, very much on identity at the moment here. And of course, that's important. But what I want to say is let's start applying that to the global economy, because if you think Black lives don't matter here when it comes to your identity, take a look at the global economy and you'll see how much Black lives matter, because we have an entire economy which is constructed around the idea that these lives don't matter. And so what I'm really trying to do is build and do some kind of education, some political education, giving people some insight to, there is a whole history of resistance and struggle here that's been erased from our understanding and our education by our leaders. I find young activists, they don't know who, I mentioned Thomas Sankara earlier. He was a very inspirational president of Burkina Faso in the 80s. Many young people here don't know who Thomas Sankara is. Unfortunately, amongst many young African activists I've come across, they don't know who Thomas Sankara is either. And there's a history here of resistance. And when we begin to describe this history, what I hope it might do is give marginalized people in my own society some empowerment, some confidence to go out and fight for a different society as well. I think for 30, 40 years now, many people across the global South, particularly in Africa, have been told you're a victim, you're an aid recipient. right? You're kind of in this hopeless position where you depend upon someone else's generosity. No. There's a long history before that, which I know many people on this call will know. And I'm teaching you, I'm not trying to teach you to suck eggs, but to try to describe that to a younger generation. And we've just been talking to some guys who, in November, they climbed up Big Ben, you know, the tower in London, which is next to our parliament, and they hung a big sign about debt saying cancel the debts and so on. And as a result of that action, they've begun learning about the whole history of resistance to colonialism. And they're very excited about it. They're going to court in October. And they're going to use that court case in order to try to get this message out to a wider public through the media and so on. And I hope that through doing that, we can give people in our country a sense of empowerment that you can actually fight back and you can win in these kind of battles. But I think that sense of power is really necessary if we're to move beyond the kind of NGO charitable framing. So I'll leave it there.
Fantastic, Nick. Thank you so much. And I think what you said complemented, I think, Bhumika's remarks really well. It was interesting, your note about Thomas Sankara. I was just thinking back to, you know, part of it is in our schools, because I was educated here in Africa. When we learn history, we learn European history. You know, if you want to do African history, you need to do it as a special elective somewhere, but it's not part and parcel of our history lessons. So there's a need to also sort of decolonize our education system. And that's part of the reason why you have young Africans that are unaware, right, of all of these issues that you've been speaking to. But apart from that, I think the reiteration, I think, of what Bhumika said about the fact that this is a systemic issue, about the fact that, you know, it needs to be dealt with at its root. I think that remains core. The point you made as well about the fact that, you know, this will happen potentially again unless we deal with the current capitalism system, I think is very key. And I think that's where our emphasis needs to be. And I think, Bhumika, you gave a lot of really great examples around how we can do that. So again, to everybody who's listening in on the call, please go ahead, put your questions in the chat. I can see a lot of really good feedback, I think, from participants saying, you know, both to Bhumika and Nick, that they really enjoyed your presentations. I thoroughly enjoyed them as well. I'm happy to kick off and then we'll open it out. So the point of this particular session, right, being the last of the series that we've been having, is to identify critical key actions, right, and practical next steps that we can take to address these systems that I think you both have so excellently articulated, right? So Bhumika, I'm going to start with you. Give us a few, right? Like what can us as civil society literally start to do now to begin to influence the global system in a way that is advantageous, it is necessary, right, for developing countries. I know you touched on a few, but I think if you can sort of articulate those in a way that everybody who's listening is able to sort of say, awesome, point 1, point 2, point 3, I think that would be fantastic, so that we, you know, leave this conversation with some next steps. So over to you, Bhumika.
Thank you both, Chenai, and I resonated so much with what is being said overall, and especially some key points that Nick made, and just want to say that, you know, ultimately debt justice is about the dispossession of the bondholder, and that, yes, exactly, the state steps in to protect and ensure that the bondholder is not dispossessed, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that moral argument must be turned on its head. This moral economy, if you borrow, you repay. It's a deeply embedded creditor morality that needs to be recalibrated with our civil society, radical narrative building. So I want to really talk about three things, not as prescriptive, but just as ideas, sort of three sort of ways forward. We talk a lot about recalibrating political narratives into a more radical, systemic, interlinked, holistic, sort of synergized output. You know, we need to spread these political narratives, do the media campaigns, do the name and shame of private creditors. That we know, and we have been doing it. We have been doing it in some ways, but I think one of the key things is these sorts of teachings and workshops and discussions and awareness building to really expand that into the realm of students, even high school students, university students, and across the spectrum of activist coalitions, from the very local level to the global level. I think we can look at several movements as inspiration. It may seem far off, but look at the way participatory budgeting was able to reach on most local village levels to a national discourse and to a global effort at a budget accountability and transparency. What are ways in which we can bring the international debt justice campaigns to the most local level to really make the linkages with building awareness, understanding, and not to say that people on the local level are not aware. They are the ones living it. They are the teachers. And it's also about these equitable collaborations and getting our guidance from people on the very grassroots level. But really, I guess what I'm talking about is a spatial coherence. Too many of us are operating entirely on the international level, which narrows the scope into a much more elite realm of those of us who are able to access international spaces, who are working in international NGOs. So let's talk about recalibrating the spatial evenness of these movements and campaigns. We know from the past, looking at name and shame media campaigns, they have a punch point, especially in creating the awareness, creating the momentum, but let's go beyond name and shame and media campaigns and op-eds into bringing people out in the streets with propositional narratives. And that is what we see as a great example, the young youth climate activists doing. And they can serve as a great example of a propositional activism of bodies on the street, of bringing, the messages on private creditors, on debt injustice, on the historical structural dependency, and making these links clear and forging alliances everywhere we can. Black Lives Matter is absolutely central to debt justice. What are the interest rates that African countries pay relative to the record low, rock bottom zero interest rates of developed countries? And that is racial injustice in the debt economy. These differentiated interest rates, and the fact that the developing countries in many ways have to resort to selling their sovereign bonds at ridiculously high interest rates, and they resort to employing currency devaluation as one of the only available competitive tools in light of the structural roots, right? Making these linkages, and I think really a third way forward is to make some, to really propel an interest in understanding debt as a historical phenomenon, right? To understand that debt has a long history. Like when you talk about even the sanctity of contracts today, there was a time when there was international legal frames of sovereign immunity that undercut this sanctity of contracts primacy. There are examples in even recent modern history where developing countries defaulted on their debts. Why are such defaults not possible today, even with the debt distress we see today? What are the changes that have happened through history? And it's our role to make these accessible, to understand the historical narrative so that we can go past. Technical is important, technical policy is important, but in many ways, technical policy sometimes erases the history. It depoliticizes the actual, depth of some of the narratives, and it shortens and shallows the scope. So we must integrate and fuse together the technical and the historical and political. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Great, Bhumika, that was excellent. Thanks so much. I think those are very specific key action points that we can run with. Nick, Any thoughts?
Well, I'll build on that because I totally agree with it. First of all, I was quite critical of the Jubilee movement at the beginning, at least here in the West. But actually, there was a phenomenal movement in the late 90s that I was part of, the anti-globalization movement, we called it. I believe it was the most diverse and international movement there's ever been in the world. And we held to account the powers that were taking forward neoliberalism. We didn't win everything. We won some things, but the movement itself was so important. For the first time, you had industrial workers and environmentalists. You had anarchists and Christians. And when we talk about Christians, I'm not a Christian, but the concept of Jubilee comes from ancient times, right? It comes from Jewish scripture, because it was seen then that if you allowed a debt to accumulate and accumulate, you'd get this inequality, this insurpassable inequality in society, and you need to deal with it. Think about Jesus in the temple, throwing out the moneylenders. So I think we have the possibility to create something global as well. Again, the pandemic helps us, but also hinders us in some ways. But I would really like to think that through with friends on the call. I mean, this is part of it, right? But we need to do more in those terms. And the other thing I think is really, really putting private creditors on the hook. We've got to if anything characterizes our age, it's the concentration of capital in the financial system. So the BlackRocks, the JP Morgans, the Goldman Sachs, the power of these corporations and what they stand for in terms of, if we want to do anything, if we want to have a livable planet, we've got to deal with this, right? Regardless of whether you care about Zambia's debt or not, you have to challenge this power, right? Because otherwise we have no habitable planet in 100 years' time. And if you're interested, our conversation is very domestically focused in the UK, and I'm always trying to push it out. If you're interested in racism, look at the power of these corporations. Look what they're effectively doing in the world. And we've got so many awful stories from the debt movement. When I start talking about Haiti's debt, people can't, Haiti was still repaying its debt to the French government after the Second World War, based upon the idea that the rebellion in that country, the revolution in that country, had robbed France of its property, of its slaves. Right till after the Second World War, they were repaying this debt. So the system is dripping with racism, and the only way we can deal with this is through tackling the way the global economy works.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Thank you so much, Nick. Let me just check one more time if we have questions. Oh, fantastic. We've got a question from Danish. It says here, considering how the spaces where these discussions on debt are taking place, like the IMF and the G20, are structurally exclusionary and non-transparent. Bhumika, this is something that you spoke to. What specific actions can civil society take to support developing countries in getting a fairer deal? Bhumika, because I know you'd mentioned this a little bit, so I'm going to throw this to you. And then Nick, of course, if you want to add, please go ahead.
Yeah, let me just look at the question.
Yeah,
of course. Yeah, of course. And what's happening with the G20's common framework or debt reprofiling, it's absolutely non-transparent. There's not exactly like press releases or fact sheets put out on this, and a lot of the information is actually we get from those who have some database access and those who have political access, as well as the business reporting in newspapers like the Financial Times, etc. So it's really not accessible. You're right, it's not accessible. I think in terms of specific actions to support developing countries in getting a fairer deal, I think one, of course, is the convening, and I also look to Nick to try to flesh this out. But I think especially with the common framework reprofiling efforts happening right now, to really generate a conversation that goes beyond media, that includes media, but also includes a kind of rapport process with civil society nationally who are working with the capital level. So with the capital level in the national scope, but also absolutely to make the issues clear in advocacy campaigns that we take to the international financial institutions. a large part of the advocacy push needs to also happen, in the capitals of the donor creditor countries. So exactly what JDC has been doing with the private creditor campaign in the city of London, and making clear, the sheer numbers of wealth drain and of profit making, and of the sheer refusal of the private creditors to participate, is extremely important. I think also in making more public the history of equitable debt restructuring, however sparse it is, the positive outcomes in certain contexts, from Argentina and beyond. We look at some examples where debt restructuring has occurred in a more inclusive and fair way. And the role of debt auditing, the role of the debt auditing process, including in Tunisia in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings in 2011, in looking at how that plays a role as well. So I think, yes, we need to combat all the negative, horrible things happening from the global economic governance spheres of the power holders, but we also need to make more accessible, as many NGO reports do, on the history of positive outcomes and best practices. And I hate that term, but examples that don't, crush your faith in the world. Some examples,
Yeah, awesome. No, that's great. Nick, do you have anything to add in like the next 30 seconds or so as we wrap up?
Just that I think there are different levels, and people like Bhumika do a fantastic job of going inside, doing advocacy inside, and letting us know what's going on outside. And sometimes I'm there too. But then there's an outside. You need to besiege these institutions when you can. Can we plan anything for the G20? Who knows? But then outside that, it's the pressure in the capitals, in the countries, and we rely on each other. We completely and don't feel because you're not in there, you're not doing anything.
I think Bhumika, you may have mentioned, or somebody did, the fact that it's a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum of us working towards addressing this issue. Fantastic. Bhumika and Nick, thank you so much. I think that was such an interesting and engaging session. I really felt so honored to listen in and moderate this conversation. I'm going to hand over now to Ilaria, who has a couple of things to say, I think relating to the debt and climate conversation. And then I think, Ilaria, you'll then hand over to Jean. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I thank you to our speaker, Tess, Nick, and Bhumika. I think it was really inspiring and motivating to listen to this session, because it kind of reminds me why we decided to work on these issues and to do this job. I mean, it was really, really motivating. And actually, I would like to say a few words on that, because I think this is the perfect session to mention that there is a new opportunity to be engaging with the debt movement. As Eurodebt and some CSOs, we are launching a new campaign. And as it was mentioned during the session, debt is inextricably linked to many other issues. So we are launching a campaign now on debt and climate, which is now in the beginning process. So we are now drafting the whole campaign and deciding on the best strategies to go forward. And the campaign will be launched in September, October, and November. So I'm just letting it sit here, and if anybody would be interested in joining the campaign or to be part of the first steering group, we are very happy to, if you would like to join us, you can just drop me a message. I will leave my email here in the chat. And especially right now, we are focusing on two groups. One who would be more focused on the comms strategy, and the other one who would be more focused on outlining the whole process of the campaign. I also think this would be a great opportunity for you and your staff and activists at the beginning to see how a campaign is developing and what it means to be in a campaign. So yeah, this campaign is going to be on debt and climate, and you can drop me a message if you're interested in joining it. Thank you very much, Chenai. And I will pass it on to Eurodebt's director, because I'm very happy to say, but also very sad, because this is the last session of the Debt Wednesdays. So we have here today Jean to give her final remarks. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Ilaria, and a big thank you to Chenai, to Bhumika, and to Nick. It has been an incredibly fascinating and very worthy last session of this incredible journey. Debt Wednesdays, it started in early spring Northern Hemisphere in the earlier part of this year. We've gone through 7 sessions with incredibly informative, fascinating speakers, 14 segments talking about various aspects of debt. I really thank everybody who participated as a speaker as well as a participant in all these sessions. I thank also the interpreters who have done an incredible job in making these sessions as open and accessible as possible so that it reaches out to as many people as we possibly can. And also obviously to the funders who supported these sessions. I think Ilaria has immediately responded to the question, what can we do as a next step? We've heard from Bhumika and from Nick, particularly about all the systemic linkages to debt. Obviously, through the 7 Debt Wednesdays, we've realized that debt is not just an economic technical issue, but it is very linked to issues of, first of all, patriarchy, to colonialism, to extractivism, to capitalism. And the question then emerges, and very rightly was asked, what can we do next? Ilaria has certainly kind of given you an immediate answer. There is a new campaign, which we are very excited about. And we hope to link up to other current struggles, including the climate struggle, and young people as part of that struggle. So do join that campaign. But I'd say, as Nick said, and as Bhumika said, there is an inside dimension to it, obviously. And all of you who are able to link into the debt movement, you're certainly invited to kind of be part of the policy discussions and the strategy, to influence the strategy and to ensure that our strategy towards the internal advocacy and the policy developments are as sharp and as linked to the realities wherever you are as possible. But there is also, very importantly and equally powerful, the external dimension. First of all, influencing the narrative. We realized in the most recent G20 statement that debt is probably going to fall off the agenda of the powers that be very soon. Debt will be a forgotten issue next year. And we are the ones who are going to ensure that that issue is not a forgotten issue. Influence the narrative, speak about it in whichever community you are a part of, whether starting from your home, in your student community, or in your professional community. Be part of whatever campaigns you come across, and do keep connected, and we would be happy to keep you informed about that. But also take the initiative. I think one inspiring thing, as Nick and Bhumika mentioned about Fridays for Future, is that everybody could take the initiative, stand outside their school with a placard and say, we refuse to be part of this climate ecocide anymore. I think there are many creative ways, and certainly today, there have to be more and more creative but more radical ways that we can struggle. Just looping back to one of our most recent publications called Sleep in the Fire. Obviously, we've talked about the dramatic situation we are in. And certainly COVID-19 and the pandemic and the humanitarian emergency has essentially tipped the balance of the crises that we already found ourselves in. whether it was a debt crisis, whether it was a crisis of inequality within our societies, but also between the North and South, whether it was a crisis of violence and patriarchy, whether it was a crisis of climate. I think all of these have only been made more dramatic by the humanitarian crisis that we are in. And essentially, the message that we were giving in that last publication is that people are not going to sleep in the fire for long. I think it is up to us to ensure that it does not come to that point, but when it does come to that point where people are rising up, we are able to channel that energy into positive and creative solutions that work for all children, women, and men, as well as the planet. Thank you very much for being part of this series, and a warm congratulations to all of you who have been able to participate in all of them, and look forward to being in touch. Thank you.
So I guess it's my role to end the meeting. So thank you so much to everybody who was a part of this. Thank you so much to the participants, to the incredible panelists. Tess, thank you so much for all that information you gave us about accessing information. And then Bhumika and Nick, all of that information around sort of very key practical next steps. Thank you so much to Eurodad for inviting me to moderate this session. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And so to everybody, again, where you are, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thanks, everyone.